Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Allie Roden, and I'm the digital media producer here at Seed World Group. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be your host. Last week on Seed Speaks, you heard how DNA and its associated technologies are changing the face of agronomy. This week, we're tackling the topic of how to manage abiotic stresses during pollination. To help us learn more, we've got two fantastic panelists joining us, Tom Cook, Research Manager at Beck's Hybrids, and Wayne Fithian, Agronomy Manager at Rob Seco. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. Let's start with some introductions. Can you tell us more about yourself, Tom?
Yeah, Tom Cook, as you mentioned, I am the Research Manager here at Beck's Hybrids. My role there is oversee anything that's related to genetic improvement, from the breeders to the development of the genetics. Been with Beck's about 5 years, been in the industry 17 years, and it's located at the headquarters here in Atlanta, Indiana, but oversee all of our U.S. operations for the breeding effort.
Awesome. And then Wayne, do you want to tell us a little bit about you? I think you're on mute, Wayne.
Sorry, forgot I needed to unmute. Thanks for having me on the panel today. I'm the agronomy manager at Rob Seco, and my tasks involve general education on agronomy and get heavily involved in product and coordinate product testing here, both in our small plot research trials and our farmer strip trials.
Thank you so much. So let's go ahead and dive into our questions. So what are some typical stressors you've been seeing in the corn and soybean fields this year? Tom, let's start with you.
Well, one of the big stressors we saw just is happening now. A line of storms going through the Corn Belt here in the U.S. Just talked to my team in southern Minnesota. Had some wind last night, so we currently are seeing some heavy winds. Seems like maybe a little more heavy winds this year than usual. Kind of related to some storms. Really, right now we're also noticing a little bit of hot nights. Not as bad as in the past, but here going forward, we're getting a little nervous. Maybe some of the hot nights, gotten plenty of rain around pollination time, but leading into pollination, maybe a little short. So just your typical environmental stressors. I don't think it's been a crazy year, but it's just been a typical stress year overall from what I've seen.
Well, and to add to that, Tom, I think one of the things that happened to a lot of people in the Corn Belt this year is that we got off to a slow start in terms of planting dates, and that can be a stressor in itself, because then the plants, both corn and soybeans, have to, they're a little bit out of the norm in terms of their growth stage relative to temperatures and daytime length, and so that's kind of altered at least the growth rate. They had to grow faster to kind of catch up, and that means the factory runs a little bit less and they make less sugar, so that can certainly be a yield limitation. And then we're all a little bit short on rain, and the further west you go, for the most part, the more severely we are short on rain, and we've lost now some of the dryland corn in the far west on the high plains.
Yeah, that's a great point, Wayne. Going off of that, over the last few years, heat and drought has been more of a problem in the U.S. What are some signs customers should be on the lookout for in terms of stress damage?
You want to go first, Tom?
I'll let you. I went through the last one, Wayne. I'll let you go
Okay. First. Well, I think, with drought especially, we see reduction in height. A lot of corn I've been looking at that's been under prolonged drought, certainly tasseled shorter than typical, so it didn't attain its normal plant height. just didn't have enough water. We're starting to see leaf burn in shallower soil or sandier spots or ridges within a field. So with drought, I always look for changes in plant height, scorching. Did I get the silks out in time to catch the pollen? Those are the types of factors I look at. Heat's a little different, and like Tom said, we haven't seen as much heat yet, but certainly we are now approaching the time of year where heat could become a real problem, and that would generally be smaller, shallower kernels.
I would add to it with the heat, especially at pollination time. Corn is pretty resilient to heat overall, but it's very especially sensitive right at the pollination time. And anytime you notice some high heat right in the week of pollination, you can definitely notice some poor pollination, scatter fill on the grain, or even lack of pollination in general in some cases, especially on inbreds for our inbred production fields. So we get a little nervous when the temperature starts to get above 95 degrees at pollination. How well will that pollen, the pollen take be? Through a drought, you can irrigate, you have other options, but heat, you really don't have many options. You just have to live with what the heat is. And corn likes heat, but not really above 95 degrees. And so, as Wayne mentioned earlier, a lot of the corn was planted late this year. Got us really nervous that we might be having pollination hit during a lot of the heat time. Seems like most of it's gotten through. We still have some corn pollinating, but for the most part, July was cool enough that we didn't notice too bad a heat. There was maybe a week or two, but overall, I think we were okay. And so we did get some good pollen take.
Awesome. And what does this mean for seed crops?
Well, I think, as Tom mentioned, inbreds are more sensitive to abiotic stresses, so heat or drought, compared to hybrid corn. Hybrid corn is just more resilient because it has that hybrid vigor. And so certainly that's one of the reasons we see a lot of seed production under irrigation, so that we can address the lack of rainfall problem that could severely limit the seed crop. If we can get it pollinated, though, and really heat, Tom kind of mentioned, heat, pollen doesn't like heat. Pollen's really good at drought. So I mentioned earlier that sometime under drought, you might not get the silks out. The ear's not very good at drought, but the ear's good at heat. So it's kind of the strengths of the two reproductive organs are a little bit different in how they interact with heat and drought. So I think that the big key now will be making sure we're timely with irrigation water if we have it in the seed fields, so that we can keep yield on track. And if we don't, then certainly drought will start to take its toll unless we start to get some rainfall across the Corn Belt fairly quickly. And of course, the wind is pretty hard on inbred corn, and we did have some seed fields affected with wind earlier or late in July, earlier this summer. But luckily, that was a fairly small area that was affected, and so I don't think it's had a major effect on the crop yet.
Wind is one of those things you don't necessarily directly think about when you think of heat, but anytime you have really hot, humid days, you tend to get stronger storms, more severe storms, tend to hit right around July, right around that rapid growth period of the corn. So it's sort of a side effect of the heat, but the heat can lead into strong storms, which does cause some issues with green snap, with some lodging. As a breeder, that's great. I love it. I'd rather see it in my field than in the farmer's field, so I can sort it out. But when it gets to hopefully by the time it gets to the farmer's field, we've already sorted out the weaker rooted or the green snap susceptible. But that's always a risk. You get high heat, you get high storms, and all the associated problems with that.
Yeah, for sure. And can these abiotic stressors affect seed supply for the coming years, or can it usually kind of recoup before the next season?
It definitely can have an effect. I think this year that has not been too extreme. There has been some dry temperatures, but a lot of the seed acres, has been mentioned, are under irrigation. That helps. Not all are under irrigation, but a lot are. That's why drought is easier to manage in a lot of cases than heat, because of the irrigation capabilities. So this year, I don't think it's too bad. There are years where drought, you can't even irrigate through the drought. It's just so severe that the corn doesn't get the rain it needs or the moisture it needs. You can only irrigate so much. This year, I think we're going to be okay. But in a severe drought year, yeah, it absolutely can lead to supply issues. We always have the option. We can use winter nursery. We can winter options in Argentina and other places. That's expensive. It's not preferred, and it also delays the crop coming back. So there is the option of catching up some there. But really, the drought and the heat can have effects, but I don't see it happening this year.
So I want to go ahead and bring in an audience question from Alex Martin. I think it's pretty relevant to what we're talking about. So obviously you said that it can have effects in the future. So when these abiotic stresses do hit, what's the best way a grower can manage it? And would anything like a biological treatment help plan for stressors?
So I could start on that. There are some biological treatments that are available for use in both corn and soybeans to alleviate stress. Right now, the products are primarily to be applied at the time the plant is thinking the most about yield initiation or yield development. So in corn, that would have been back, V5, V7, or earlier in the season when the plant's really starting to put resources toward the number of kernel rows and the number of kernels and actual ear development at an embryonic stage. But for soybeans, soybeans are now coming into R1, early R2, and those products could help alleviate some of the stress that we could see yet this season in the soybean crop, because soybeans are just now starting to think about how much yield and how big they're going to make their pods and how many seeds they're going to have for pod.
Yeah, absolutely. August is obviously very critical for soybeans. Corn, it's what's initiated is initiated, and now you're just trying to protect what you have. Almost too late now at this point to even worry about fungicides, but fungicides earlier in response to storms can help, and biologicals early on. But from here forward, the concentration would be on soybeans.
Awesome. And how have crop genetics changed to help them withstand these stressors?
Well, I'm going to start on that, even though Tom's a breeder, because I've been part of some of the trait development work in corn, and certainly we now have multiple approaches to improving corn's tolerance to drought faster or more completely than we can during using traditional breeding techniques. I think the really neat thing is that there are a lot of nice genes that are heritable and that we can move and sort and bring forward, some of them natural to the corn crop and some of them from other sources, as an example of, for example, Drought Guard hybrid from the Bayer trait portfolio. But we also have marker-assisted breeding, and we have the Agrish-Artesian technique, which brings forward native genes into lines that didn't previously carry those genes, and genes that are very actively involved in improvement in drought tolerance in lines that without any impact on top end yield, but in lines that didn't previously carry those genes.
The good news about a stress year, anytime you get any of these abiotic stresses, as a breeder, we love to see that because we actually get to select to prevent that for the future. If you don't see a stress year, we have no idea how the genetics work against stress. But as you have a stress year, if it's a high temperature year, if it's a drought year, any of the hybrids that survive through our small plot trials during that year should be fairly resistant to that. So yeah, I think the genetics have certainly changed. Certainly in the last 20 years, I think even in the last 5 years, we've become much more resilient to stressors, mainly because we've seen the stressors during the season. And that's just through natural breeding and natural selection. You top off that with some of the different biotech technologies that Wayne mentioned, and even in the future, getting into gene editing, we may even be able to have more promise of improved tolerance. But as a breeder, they say you can only improve what you can select for. And in the past couple of years, we've definitely been able to select for some heat, select for some drought, and so it has absolutely increased our genetics, and the genetic potential has certainly improved.
Awesome. And I'm going to take another audience question from Ashley Robinson. Are there any new crop varieties which have been developed recently that help with some of these pollination problems?
Most certainly, there are several varieties that are available especially and companies know a lot about them. So you can talk to your seed provider and find out about hybrids that are available for pretty much any geography that are either naturally selected for improved drought tolerance, the way that Tom mentioned from our breeding trials, or that have been enhanced in some way for their drought tolerance, either via a GM or a native trait type approach. And I think Tom's right. This gene editing offers a lot of promise to help accelerate both methods of improving drought tolerance and heat tolerance in corn. I think the key is having those environments in your testing program, and ideally having managed stress environments where you can look specifically at that type of stress in the absence of other stressors. And that's a big part of, I think, the capabilities of what will hopefully steer us into the future, into a more rapid improvement in development of genotypes that will tolerate these types of stresses.
I think there's been a lot of good education of the local seed salesmen. I think they certainly know their products very well. And most companies, if not all companies, have been doing an excellent job of conveying the research knowledge that we learn from the researchers into the seed salesmen. So your local seed salesmen, seed consultants, and others can really help provide what those varieties are. They're going to be very regional specific. I think we can really start pegging the exact environment that hybrids work in now. And not just the environments, not just the genetics, but I think there's a lot of work in biologicals and fertilizer and other things, as the earlier question mentioned, such as at Beck's here, our PFR efforts, our professional farm research, looking through a lot of these different treatments, a lot of these different options, see what works, see what doesn't. The information's out there, and most seed companies are absolutely willing to share it.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, Tom, I really think that it's important to stay local in those kinds of discussions, because drought is very different in Burlington, Colorado, as compared to Atlantic Iowa, or in central Indiana. So you want to understand how the hybrid not only tolerates drought on its own, but how it tolerates the type of drought conditions and the other stressors that are going to be critical to success in each of those environments. You've got to have drought tolerance in Burlington, Colorado, but you also got to have some northern and some gray leaf spot tolerance if you're in the eastern corn belt, or some tar spot tolerance. So you want to make sure that you're not over selecting on any one trait, and you're still looking at the combination of traits that are going to give you the most likely chance of success in that field.
And you mentioned the drought timing, and drought type can really be critical too. We're talking a lot about pollination now, but that drought could be when you're planting. There's right after seed emergence, the drought can come. It can come right at pollination. It can come during pod fill or seed fill. So when that drought hits is very critical as well. Drought is not drought. There are so many types of drought, and when it hits, just because I have a drought tolerant line doesn't mean it's tolerant of all droughts. And so I think it's very critical to learn those hybrids and learn when that tolerance exists.
Yeah, and you both have touched on this a bit, but do you want to delve a little deeper into how we can combat these stressors in the future?
Research and education really are certainly going to help out. It's very difficult to test in a stress environment, because it's very difficult to predict when the stress is going to hit, and it's very difficult to get uniform data out of a stress location. But the more options we have, the more shots on goal we have to see stress environments, the more it's going to improve our genetics. It's more going to improve our agronomic research. And so just having the ability to see the stress environments as we have the past few years absolutely is going to help us going forward. And I would fully expect next year there will be regions of stress in the following year. Every year somewhere in the U.S. is under drought stress. Every year somewhere in the U.S. is under heat stress. And it's a matter of finding those spots and finding what data those research trials can show us.
Yeah, and I think our ability to track and understand climate in a computerized way, so that we can manage big data sets and then correlate those to what we saw in our trials, really helps you start to pinpoint, what was the dominant factor affecting this area versus another area. And one of the things I like to talk to farmers about is that you might farm in central Iowa, but this year you might be having a Nebraska year, and next year you might have an Illinois year, and 3 years from now you might have kind of a Missouri year. So it's important to think about that stability of product performance over a large enough geographic area, so that you're helping address the problems that you could see in your field next year, because you don't know which one of those years you're going to have next year, whether it's going to be like you would typically have, or more influenced by factors that are a little bit altered from normal.
Yeah, stability is absolutely the key, having that stable product, because you don't know. You can't predict what the weather's going to be. You can't predict what the stressors are going to be. You can read Old Farmer's Almanac all you want, but it's not right all the time.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. That's all the time we have. But I know I learned a lot, and I hope that everyone listening learned something as well. If you like this topic, make sure to tune in next week, where my colleague Ashley Robinson is talking about straight cut canola versus swathing canola. See you all then.